Hi there and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast, and tonight I'm talking a little bit about the Spanish Civil War and about the complexities of the violence in the Spanish Civil War and the run-up to the conflict. I'm looking at The Spanish Holocaust by Paul Preston, which is an extraordinary book, in which he places the blame for the huge loss of life during the Civil War and afterwards almost exclusively at the foot of Spain's generals and the political right. But it would be disingenuous to see it exclusively in those terms. There was revolutionary violence as well, and in the interests of I suppose balance, but balance isn't really the right word, because it's not really the purpose here to be kind of both siding about fascism, but in the interests of presenting a kind of wider contextual picture, I really want to talk about the revolutionary violence. So in chapter 8 of the book, Revolutionary Terror in Madrid, Paul Preston writes, "The military uprising, ostensibly against a non-existent communist takeover plot, provoked the collapse of the structures of law and order. To make matters worse, in an effort to convince the great powers to support the Republic, the cabinet formed on the 19th of July was made up exclusively of middle-class liberals, and thus neither respected nor initially obeyed by the left-wing parties and unions that defeated the uprising." So the uprising across Spain fails initially in its goals, and particularly the part of the uprising in Madrid failed, and that means that Madrid very quickly becomes besieged by the fascist generals who are flown over from North Africa by Hitler's Condor Legion. And had Madrid fallen quickly, that would have been the end of the Spanish Republic. It takes a further 3 years of fighting to defeat the Republic, and the intervention of the Republican Army and also of the First International Brigades managed to prevent Madrid from falling. But it was a combined working class, trade union and leftist parties, particularly the anarchist movement, effort that prevents the fascist conquest of Madrid, and also of Barcelona. Paul Preston continues, "An outburst of revolutionary fervour and an orgy of killing would demonstrate once more that Spain's harshly repressive society had produced a brutalised underclass. The key events that underlay the violence in Republican Madrid took place in the first 2 days. The opening of the prisons saw hundreds of common criminals released, among them sadists and psychopaths who were only too willing to use the political chaos as a shield for their activities. Moreover, they had ample motives to seek revenge against the magistrates and judges who'd put them in jail. In fact, out of fear of reprisals or because of their sympathy with the coup, many judicial functionaries went into hiding. More than 100 judges were murdered. A central factor in the violence was the distribution of arms in the wake of the defeat of the military uprising. On the evening of the 19th of July, the general in charge of the coup in the capital, Joaquin Fanjul, took command of the troops, and the Falangist volunteers gathered in the Montana barracks near the Plaza de España. He was unable to lead them out because the building was surrounded by a huge crowd of civilians, together with about 100 civil guards and a few assault guards. Fanjul's men opened fire with machine guns. Those with rifles replied. Early the following morning, an even larger crowd converged on the barracks, accompanied now by 2 artillery pieces, albeit with a few shells. Cannon fire and a bomb dropped by a loyalist aircraft saw a white flag extended through the window. The flag may have been waved by one of the many pro-republican soldiers among Fanjul's forces, but the crowd advanced in expectation of immediate surrender. And it's interesting how the whole scene has the kind of the sort of the storming of the Bastille sense about it. That there is this populist anger towards not just an ancien regime, but an insurgent attempt to overthrow a popular democracy. Many were killed or wounded when they met with a burst of machine gun fire, writes Paul Preston. The outraged throng pulled back, but when a second white flag appeared, swarmed forward only to be greeted once more by the rattle of machine guns. Finally, just before noon, the now infuriated mob broke in. Weapons were distributed and a massacre ensued at the hands of the pro-republican conscripts from within and the militiamen from outside. A giant left-winger hurled officers from windows. Some officers committed suicide and the phalangists who had joined the rebels inside were shot. So here we have the culmination of a long period of violent, brutal repression on the part of the right. It is really the kind of the outcome of a kind of a long period of class warfare. One of the points that the Spanish Holocaust makes is that throughout the 1920s and 30s, the landowning class, the Catholic Church, and the elites within the army had waged a kind of a war of attrition against the Spanish peasantry, seeing them as barely human in some regards, and had seen the prospects of organisation amongst the Spanish peasants and the demand for better working conditions as something akin to treason. A strange anti-Semitism ran through the rhetoric of the landowners, being as Jews had been expelled from Spain in the 15th century. There were virtually no Jews in early 20th century Spain, and yet the association between this kind of this fascist association between communism and the Jews, and the idea that the Spanish peasants were somehow kind of not fully kind of Europeanly Spanish. They were viewed as being sort of a kind of a darker skinned and therefore sort of less Aryan version of Spanish masculinity or femininity. There was kind of something almost alien about the peasantry, and there was this in lots and lots of kind of fascist Catholic writing at the time. There's this kind of rather ludicrous idea that somehow the Jews are somehow behind it all. This kind of culture that existed that positioned the peasants as either kind of or the Spanish working class as kind of expendable, as something to be used purely for its labour, and then forced to conform and obey otherwise. It's that kind of culture that enables army officers to gun down or ordinary Spanish people in cold blood during the siege, the kind of the siege experience required, and the Phalange Party, which emerged out of Gil Roble's Cedar Party, Gil Roble, really the kind of the Spanish answer to Nazism. This party was inevitably going to side with the junta, and the attempts to overthrow to overthrow the republic, and so meet with kind of no mercy when it comes to the final reckoning when the prison has been stormed. On that brilliantly sunny day, sunny Monday morning, on the 20th of July, an English nurse, Mary Bingham de Urquidi, saw defeated soldiers being shot while a baying crowd howled abuse. She counterpointed her gruesome tale with evidence of the humanity of some Republicans. She saw a 10-year-old boy beg for the life of his father who was about to be shot. His plea that he and his father were Republicans was successful. The mob was moved on by Republican soldiers, and numerous corpses could be seen. Mary Bingham seemed unaware that many of the bodies were of Republican civilians killed while attacking the barracks. In contrast with the firmly pro-rebel ambassador of Chile, Aurelio Núñez Morgado, described the events of La Montana as the start of the Madrid massacre. Certainly, many of the weapons distributed when the barracks was taken would be used over the next 5 months in the repression. In the course of the 19th of July, some churches were burned, often because rebel soldiers had been storing arms there and now had fired from the towers on groups of workers. Other churches were left intact because their parish priest had opened them and invited in the militiamen to see that there were no fascists inside. The art treasures therein were thus saved. In the first few days, what was called popular justice was meted out spontaneously and indiscriminately against anyone denounced as a rightist. However, in Madrid, as happened in Barcelona and Valencia, virtually every left-wing political party and trade union soon established its own squads, the Checas, to eliminate suspected fascists. A headquarters set up in requisition buildings. They often had private prisons where detainees were interrogated. Executions usually took place in the outskirts of the city. In Madrid, there were nearly 200 of these squads, if those set up by recent freed common criminals were included. The principal Checas, run by left-wing parties and unions, numbered about 25. Considered to be warriors in the social war, criminals were often accepted into anarchist rearguard militias. Although far from having a monopoly on the worst excesses, the anarchists were the most prominent in the bloodshed in Madrid. Their Checas often took the names given respectively to CNT and PCE neighbourhood headquarters and cells, the anarchists using Libertarian Orthenium and the communists using the name Radio. So this is complex, this is problematic, this is a picture of the Spanish Civil War that very, very often doesn't quite emerge, and it shows that during a period of revolutionary violence, during a period of civil war, on both sides there is no room for compromise and no room for mercy. The story there of the boy pleading for his father's life and the mercy being shown, that's an outlier. That sort of thing rarely happened during this period. And because you have two contrasting visions of Spain, one a hierarchical, traditional, authoritarian and autocratic Spain run by army officers, Catholic priests and landowners, and the other a Spain which is a kind of a mixture of social democracy and revolutionary politics. The two are wholly incompatible with one another, and only a fight to the finish will determine what Spain will be. Both sides view the other as an existential threat, and both sides view the other as something to annihilate. And in both cases, they're right. They are an existential threat to one another. And civil wars produce these sorts of conditions. One significant factor as well is that during this period of revolutionary uprising, the standard forces of law and order can't do an awful lot. You have a republic that is assailed by a fascist insurrection, and the forces of law and order, the police, the militia, are simply overwhelmed by the anarchist militias that are unleashed as a result of this chaos, that are armed as a result of this chaos. The ability, writes Paul Preston, of the forces of order to control the checkers was severely circumscribed. Many policemen, assault guards and civil guards supported the military rebellion and had either crossed the lines or else been arrested. Many others were often suspect, and the assault guards and civil guards who remained loyal had to be deployed at the front. The consequent decimation of various police forces facilitated the activities of the rearguard militia groups. Nevertheless, the government began almost at once to take faltering steps to put a stop to the theft, extortion and murder being committed by some checkers, although it would be 5 months before anything like full control was established. The new Minister of the Interior, General Sebastián Poses Pereira, had been Inspector General of the Civil Guard until the 19th of July. He had worked frantically, albeit in vain, to limit the spread of the rebellion and within the corps. Now he worked equally hard and unsuccessfully to stop the checkers carrying out arrests and house searches. The Civil Guard and the Assault Guard had been in the prior decade, from the mid-20s to the mid-30s, some of the most egregious and wanton perpetrators of the crimes of Spain's landlords, and had been quite overtly used as a sort of somewhere between the kind of the Pinkerton detectives in America and the brown shirts in Germany, a real kind of blunt instrument of class rule, perpetrating horrendous violence, particularly in rural Spain. So it's hardly surprising that when Franco and the other generals cross from North Africa into southern Spain, that this is a very exciting moment for fascist-leaning police officers and civil guards. So it placed the Republic under huge pressure. And the idea across sort of much of Spain that the Republic was showing its true colours by supposedly allowing these lawless bands on the streets in order to carry out lynch mob vigilante justice. This is a kind of a very toxic and wholly untrue interpretation of the wishes of the Republic, but it did Republican Spain an immense amount of damage. Paul Preston writes, the targets of the self-appointed checkers and militia groups were not only the active supporters of the military coup. Many totally innocent individuals were arrested and sometimes murdered, as one middle-class detainee wrote later, simply for owning a business, or having opposed a strike, for having expressed support for the suppression of the Asturian Rising, for belonging to the clergy, or for being rude to a maid's boyfriend, or to the lout of a doorman. Concierges would often tip off the checker on the basis of the arrival of an unknown visitor or an unusual package, or because an occupant of the building never left home. Suspicion was enough. Antonio Machado, a fervent pro-Republican poet, was arrested in the early days of the war in a cafe in the Glorieta de Cambery because a militiaman mistook him for a priest. So this is really the kind of the everyday stuff of the kind of breakdown of the functioning of a state, and the inability of said state to deal with militias. Now, the militias are notionally there in defence of the Republic, but when you get down to a grassroots level, many of the anarchists who were patrolling the streets with rifles didn't even like the Republic, didn't care for it at all. They saw it as a kind of like a bourgeois republic, which it is, and saw it as being anti-working class. One of the great tragedies of the left in the 20th century is, and one of the great sort of explanations for the almost always stoppable rise of fascism, is that fascism's opponents spend an awful lot of time persecuting, kidnapping and shooting one another. And of course, if you look at the example of the Weimar government, the Weimar government was there is an example of a bourgeois government equally capable of eradicating and shooting leftist militias. So the across Europe in the 1920s and 30s, the shoe has been on both feet, shall we say. Okay, so we're going to finish there in just a moment, but I do intend to look a bit more at Spain. I've got Giles Tremlett's new history of the International Brigades to dive into, so we'll carry on with this in a little while. But anyway, I hope you find this interesting and useful, and I will catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Thanks very much, folks. All the best. Bye-bye.